The emergency room at Grady Memorial in Atlanta reeked of antiseptic and fear. Nurses covered their faces with extra masks, not because of protocol, but because the smell was unbearable. A man lay on the gurney, thrashing, his skin blistering and peeling as though death itself had taken root under his flesh. The sound of his screams echoed through the sterile white hallways. High, broken, desperate. One doctor muttered under his breath, "It's like his body is rotting from the inside out." This was Ethan Miller, a 38-year-old office worker who had walked into the ER less than an hour earlier on his own 2 feet. Now, under the glare of fluorescent lights, he looked like a corpse still clinging to life. Monitors beeped frantically as his blood pressure plummeted. Every few minutes, the stench of decay seemed to grow stronger, forcing even seasoned trauma nurses to turn away in disbelief. One whispered, "I've never seen anything like this. People don't rot alive." But this wasn't the start of Ethan's nightmare. To understand how he ended up here, flesh breaking down in real time, doctors powerless to stop it, you have to go back less than 24 hours, to a night that was supposed to be nothing more than a thrill. A night that began with a swipe on a dating app, a laugh over drinks, and an invitation he thought would stay secret. Atlanta is a city of masks. By day, Ethan was the picture of a routine middle-class life. Collared shirts, long commutes, and quick dinners reheated in the microwave. By night, though, he was restless, lonely. He had no wife, no kids, and no close friends to question where he disappeared on weekends. And like many men seeking something different, he turned to late-night dating apps where names were fake, profiles blurred, and nobody asked too many questions. That's where he met Latrice Johnson. She didn't look like the women Ethan usually messaged. At 42, she was older than him. At 500 pounds, she was larger than anyone he had ever been with. But there was something about her profile, confident, unapologetic, even daring. She wasn't hiding behind filters. Her bio read, "If you can't handle a real woman, don't waste my time." For a man who spent his days feeling invisible, that boldness pulled him in. On Friday night, after a couple of beers at a bar downtown, Ethan agreed to meet her. She greeted him with a smile that was equal parts warm and secretive. She spoke with a soft drawl, made him laugh within minutes, and carried herself with an aura that said she'd lived through things she wasn't about to explain. By the time midnight rolled around, Ethan had followed her back to her small apartment in a rundown complex on the south side. From the outside, the building looked like it belonged in another decade. Cracked paint, buzzing neon lights, neighbors who pretended not to see anything. Inside her unit, the air smelled sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with perfume. The blinds were drawn, candles burned low, and the shadows danced across walls stained with time. Ethan didn't notice the bottle shoved under the couch, the prescription vials hidden in a shoebox by the door, or the faint reddish blotches on the sheets. He was too focused on the woman in front of him, on the thrill of doing something reckless. By 3 a.m, Atlanta was quiet. The hum of traffic had died down. In Latrice's bedroom, the city might as well not have existed. Ethan thought it was just one more forgettable night, one more secret adventure he would never mention again. He had no idea it would be the last night of his life, lived normally. Because by sunrise, when the first thin beams of light slipped through the blinds, Ethan Miller's body was already beginning to betray him. His skin itched and burned. His chest heaved as if every breath carried knives. And within hours, the man who thought he'd found nothing more than a one-night stand would be fighting to keep his flesh from falling away. What happened in that room? What secret did Latrice carry? And how could a single night with a stranger lead to a death so grotesque that even veteran investigators still whisper about it today? This is the story the media would come to call the Rotting Man case. To understand the nightmare that unfolded, investigators had to piece together the last hours before Ethan Miller's body began to collapse. What they found painted the picture of a man chasing excitement in the shadows of Atlanta and stumbling into something far darker. Ethan wasn't the type people described as reckless. By all accounts, he was an ordinary 38-year-old office worker. His co-workers remembered him as quiet, polite, the kind of man who never raised his voice and always stayed late to finish spreadsheets nobody else wanted to touch. But those same co-workers also admitted later, nobody really knew him outside of work. He kept to himself. No wife, no children, no real friends who could say what he did after hours. That privacy made it easy for Ethan to live a double life. On Friday nights, while most of his colleagues went home to families or happy hours, Ethan opened the dating apps. He scrolled past hundreds of faces, most of them blurs, some of them fake. And that's where he met her, Latrice Johnson. Her profile didn't look like the others. No angled selfies, no half-hidden smiles. Latrice's photos were bold. A plus-sized black woman in her 40s, staring straight into the camera, daring anyone to swipe right. At 500 pounds, she didn't hide her size. Her bio read simply, "I'm a queen. If you can't handle a real woman, don't waste my time." Something about that line struck Ethan. Maybe it was the confidence, maybe the mystery. Maybe it was the way her eyes seemed to follow him even through a cheap phone screen. He messaged her. She replied instantly. And just like that, Ethan stepped into a world he didn't understand. Later, detectives would recover their chat history. The conversation started playful, even funny. Latrice teased him, asked questions that felt more like dares. She suggested they meet that night. Ethan hesitated until his third beer loosened his caution. At 11:47 p.m., he sent the message that sealed his fate. "Where should I come?" Her address was in South Atlanta, a neighborhood Ethan rarely visited. The streets were quieter, dimly lit, and the apartment buildings bore the scars of time. When Ethan pulled up, his car headlights washed over cracked concrete and flickering neon. A neighbor later told police she noticed him sitting in his car for several minutes, gripping the wheel, almost as if he was debating whether to leave. But curiosity, or maybe loneliness, won. When he knocked, Latrice opened the door with a smile. She was wearing a flowing robe, her hair tied back, perfume heavy in the air. Ethan, nervous, made a joke. She laughed, low and confident, and waved him inside. The apartment was small, the kind of place where every sound echoed. Candles burned on the table, casting long shadows that seemed to crawl up the walls. The blinds were drawn tight. Ethan noticed faint stains on the carpet, prescription bottles shoved halfway under the couch. But he ignored them. He was too focused on the woman in front of him. They talked for over an hour. Neighbors reported hearing music through the thin walls, laughter, then silence. By 2 a.m, Ethan was sitting on Latrice's bed. She leaned close, whispering things he would never repeat. In his inebriated state, the unease that should have sent him running instead only fueled the adrenaline. Whatever reservations, he had melted away. Investigators would later note one disturbing detail. The sheets on Latrice's bed bore dark blotches, as if liquids had soaked into the fabric over time. The mattress was old, sagging, and when crime scene technicians eventually pulled it apart, they found something else. Tiny specks that looked like dry blood. But Ethan didn't know that. To him, it was just another reckless night. A secret fling he would bury under his weekday routine. As dawn approached, Atlanta began to stir outside. Delivery trucks rumbled down cracked streets, the first light of morning breaking through a cloudy sky. Inside that dim apartment, Ethan closed his eyes, believing the night was over. He couldn't have known that in those final hours, something had already passed between them, something that would start to devour him from the inside out. By sunrise, Ethan would no longer be the man who walked into that apartment. He would be the man fighting to hold onto his very flesh. When Ethan Miller opened his eyes that morning, he expected nothing more than the awkward shuffle of leaving a stranger's apartment. Instead, the first thing he felt was pain. Not the dull ache of a hangover, but a sharp, searing sting spreading across his skin like fire. At first, he thought maybe it was an allergic reaction. His arms were red, patches of skin blotched as though he'd slept in poison ivy. He sat up, blinking against the thin light seeping through Latrice's blinds. That's when the smell hit him. It wasn't the sweet perfume from the night before. It was something sour, fetid, like raw meat left out in the sun. He looked down at his chest and froze. Tiny blisters were forming across his skin, some already rupturing, oozing a yellowish fluid that stuck to the sheets. Jesus Christ, he muttered, stumbling to his feet. In the bathroom mirror, the reflection staring back at him barely looked human. His face was pale, sweaty, but worse, around his jawline and neck, the flesh had begun to discolor. Purplish, mottled patches spread like ink under his skin. He pressed his fingers against it and nearly screamed. The tissue felt soft, wrong, as though it was breaking apart beneath his touch. Behind him, Latrice appeared in the doorway. She didn't look surprised, not shocked, just silent. Her eyes met his in the mirror, unreadable. "What's happening to me?" Ethan's voice cracked with terror. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, pulled her robe tighter, and walked back into the bedroom. Ethan staggered after her, but by the time he reached the door, the apartment was quiet. Latrice was gone. Panic surged through him. His heart pounded so violently it hurt. He grabbed his shirt from the floor, pulled it over his raw skin, and stumbled toward the front door. Each step was agony. His legs felt heavy, his breath ragged. He barely made it into the hallway before collapsing. Neighbors later described the scene as unlike anything human. One woman said she opened her door after hearing the thud, only to be overwhelmed by a stench so powerful it made her gag. Ethan was sprawled on the carpet, moaning, his skin sloughing away in strips. When paramedics arrived, they nearly refused to load him into the ambulance. His body temperature was spiking, his blood pressure dropping, and the odor of decay clung to him like a cloud. One EMT later testified, it was like carrying a corpse that was still alive. By the time he reached Grady Memorial Hospital, his condition had worsened. His fingertips were turning black, gangrenous. Nurses cut away his shirt and gasped as chunks of dead tissue came with it. His chest and abdomen looked as though they belonged to a man weeks in the grave, not hours removed from a date. Doctors scrambled to stabilize him. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, high-dose 4 fluids. Nothing slowed the progression. Every hour, new patches of skin turned necrotic. The smell grew so overpowering that staff had to double mask and keep the door closed at all times. Meanwhile, detectives were called in. It wasn't common for law enforcement to be involved so early in a medical case, but the speed of Ethan's deterioration was too bizarre to ignore. They wanted to know who was with him the night before. What had he been exposed to? When Ethan regained enough strength to speak, he whispered a name, Latrice. Latrice Johnson. He tried to describe her, the apartment, the candles, the laughter. But his voice kept breaking, and the pain forced him into silence. The last clear sentence he managed was chilling. She knew this would happen. Investigators rushed to the address he gave. But when they arrived, the apartment was empty. No Latrice. No furniture. Not even the candles. The place looked scrubbed, abandoned, as though she had been planning her disappearance for weeks. The only things left behind were stains in the carpet and faint impressions on the mattress springs. Back at the hospital, Ethan's condition spiraled. Doctors made the agonizing decision to amputate part of his left arm in an attempt to stop the infection spread. Hours later, they had to remove part of his right leg. The necrosis didn't stop. It moved faster than their scalpels could keep up. Reporters got wind of the story. Atlanta man rotting alive. One headline read. Rumors spread online that he'd been poisoned, cursed, even hexed. On true crime forums, users began calling him the rotting man before the police had even issued a statement. And through it all, Latrice was nowhere to be found. What exactly had she done to Ethan? Was it a disease she carried, a deliberate infection, or something stranger, something that couldn't be explained by science alone? For Ethan, none of those questions mattered anymore. His only reality was pain, and the terrifying knowledge that with each passing minute, there was less of him left to save. When Ethan Miller was wheeled into surgery for the second time in less than 24 hours, detectives from the Atlanta Police Department were already combing through the details of his final night of freedom. Something about his words, hoarse, broken, but clear enough to name Latrice Johnson, made this more than a medical mystery. It was a potential crime. Detective Carla Hughes was the first to take the lead. A 20-year veteran, she'd seen overdoses, domestic disputes, even ritualistic killings. But she'd never heard of a man's body literally rotting alive in real time. Still, protocol was protocol. Hughes and her partner, Detective Aaron Cole, drove straight to the address Ethan had given. The apartment complex was a crumbling 3-story block of concrete, the kind of place most people didn't notice unless they lived there. Faded graffiti marked the stairwells. Trash cans overflowed in the parking lot. To the neighbors, another police cruiser pulling up was just part of the scenery. But when Hughes knocked on the door to Unit 3B, nobody answered. The lock was intact, no signs of forced entry. After a brief exchange with the building manager, they got access. What they found inside chilled even seasoned investigators. The apartment was stripped bare. No furniture, no dishes, no clothing. The only items left behind were a sagging mattress with deep stains and a faint smell that made both detectives gag. Underneath the mattress, wedged between rusty springs, they found the first clue, an empty pill bottle labeled with an unfamiliar antiviral medication. The prescription was written not to Latrice Johnson, but to another name entirely, Vanessa Moore. It was the first sign that Latrice might not be who she claimed. Hughes ordered a full forensic sweep. Technicians swabbed the mattress, pulled fibers from the carpet, and collected the pill bottle. Under the bathroom sink, they discovered something stranger, a shoebox filled with scraps of paper. On them were handwritten names, phone numbers, and photos of men printed off social media. Some were marked with X's. Others had dates written next to them, the most recent being just 3 weeks prior. Looks like a hit list, Cole muttered. One photo in particular stood out, a man in his mid-40s, smiling awkwardly in a family portrait. When detectives ran his name, they learned he had been reported missing 6 months earlier after failing to return from a date. His case had gone cold. Until now. The deeper they searched, the darker the picture became. Behind the couch, crime scene techs found more empty medication bottles, different antivirals, some used to treat HIV, others experimental. Each bore a different alias. Moore, Johnson, Lewis. Whoever this woman was, she had cycled through identities the way most people cycled through phone chargers. And then came the most disturbing discovery, a locked drawer in the kitchen. Inside was a notebook, the cover stained and curling at the edges. The pages contained meticulous entries, part diary, part manifesto. One line read, "They use us. They discard us. But now they will pay. They will remember me in their bodies." Another entry, dated 2 months earlier. "The doctors say I should be careful, that I could kill. They don't understand. That's the point." For Hughes, The implications were terrifying. This wasn't just a woman hiding a medical condition. This was a woman who seemed to be weaponizing it. Meanwhile, at Grady Memorial, doctors were fighting a losing battle. Ethan had already lost one arm and one leg. His kidneys were shutting down. The infection raced faster than their treatments. When Hughes visited him, hoping to get more details, Ethan could barely speak. His lips cracked, his voice a rasp. But he managed to whisper one sentence that stayed with her. She laughed when I asked what was happening. She laughed. Back at headquarters, Hughes and Cole began piecing together Latrice's trail. Her phone number from the dating app was a burner. The apartment lease had been signed under yet another alias, with a fake ID. Utility bills were paid with prepaid debit cards. Whoever she was, she had built her life on smoke and mirrors. Still, threads began to emerge. Using the photos from the shoebox, detectives cross-referenced with missing persons reports across Georgia. At least 3 other men had disappeared after last being seen heading to dates. None of their bodies had been recovered. When Hughes briefed the department, the room fell silent. This wasn't just one man's medical horror. This was potentially a serial predator, a woman leaving behind a trail of vanished men and rotting corpses. The press caught wind quickly. News vans parked outside the hospital. Headlines screamed Black Widow on the run, and IS Atlanta harboring a female serial killer. On talk shows, pundits debated whether Latrice was a monster or a victim lashing out. Hashtags trended. Hashtag rotting man case. Hashtag who is Latrice. Hashtag Atlanta Black Widow. For Hughes, none of the noise mattered. What mattered was finding Latrice, if that was even her real name, before another man ended up like Ethan. But with every alias, every apartment abandoned, she seemed to slip further into the shadows. The last clue they uncovered that week came from a neighbor in the complex. A man who remembered seeing Latrice late at night, loading boxes into the trunk of a beat-up Ford Crown Victoria. She looked calm, he said, like she'd done this before. By the time Hughes traced the plates, the car had already been abandoned 3 counties away. Inside, police found only a discarded robe and another empty pill bottle. It was becoming clear Latrice was always one step ahead, and Ethan Miller's gruesome fate might not be the last. By the time detectives uncovered Latrice's abandoned apartment, doctors at Grady Memorial Hospital were engaged in what one surgeon later described as a losing battle against something we didn't even understand. Ethan Miller's body was disintegrating faster than medical textbooks could explain. Doctors initially suspected a rare bacterial infection, something like necrotizing fasciitis, the so-called flesh-eating disease. But the speed was unlike anything they'd seen. In classic cases, necrosis spread inches per day. In Ethan's case, it was devouring whole limbs in hours. Dr. Elaine Shun, an infectious disease specialist flown in from Emory University, led the investigation. When she first entered Ethan's isolation room, she nearly gagged behind her mask. His body looked less like a living man and more like a cadaver halfway through decomposition. Biopsies revealed something staggering. Ethan's tissue was teeming with multiple strains of aggressive bacteria, not just one. It was as though his body had become a laboratory for destruction. Staph, strep, anaerobic bacteria, all flourishing together in a lethal storm. The lab results also suggested traces of an unusual viral load, something that seemed to accelerate cellular breakdown. It was like watching a house burn from both ends, Dr. Chen explained. The bacteria were chewing through the flesh, and the virus was weakening the structure that normally holds everything together. He had no defenses left. But where had this come from? The pill bottles found in Latrice's apartment gave one clue. Several were antivirals commonly used in the treatment of HIV and other retroviruses. Others were experimental medications, not available in pharmacies, likely obtained through clinical trials or black market channels. When the CDC was called in, their analysis painted an even darker picture. Latrice, if she truly was the patient behind those prescriptions, was not just HIV positive. She carried what specialists described as a recombinant strain, a mutation resistant to most treatments, coupled with a bacterial colonization that thrived in her system. Simply put, she was a walking biological weapon. Was it intentional? Or had she simply stopped caring, letting her body become a reservoir of pathogens? The diary discovered under her mattress suggested the former. Entries about making them pay and "they will remember me" in their bodies hinted at someone who knew exactly what she carried and chose to unleash it. For Ethan, that meant the moment of intimacy sealed his fate. Microscopic invaders entered his bloodstream, spreading through his body like wildfire. Within hours, they were dismantling him at a cellular level. The medical team tried everything: broad-spectrum antibiotics, antiviral cocktails, emergency amputations, hyperbaric oxygen treatments meant to slow bacterial growth. But nothing worked. His infection was too advanced, too aggressive. Reporters latched onto the horror, dubbing it the rot from within. News anchors compared it to stories of bioterrorism, whispering about whether Latrice was a lone predator or part of something larger. Social media exploded with conspiracy theories. Was she a government experiment gone rogue? A carrier of a lab-engineered virus? Or simply a woman weaponizing her illness out of rage and despair? On the ground, detectives like Carla Hughes try to sift fact from rumor. In her view, the case was simpler and more chilling. A woman, scorned by life, who had chosen vengeance in the most intimate way possible. Meanwhile, Ethan's decline was relentless. His family described visiting him as watching someone rot alive. Doctors covered his body with sterile dressings, but the stench seeped through. His once strong frame shrank to skin and bone, except for the bloated, infected patches that oozed and cracked. In a haunting press conference, Dr. Chun addressed the public. This is not a curse. It's not witchcraft. It's biology. A perfect storm of infection. But make no mistake, if this woman is still out there, she is dangerous. Intimate contact with her could mean a death sentence. The revelation turned fear into panic. Men across Atlanta began flooding clinics, demanding tests, terrified they might have encountered the mysterious Black Widow. Online forums traded stories of disastrous dates, each one claiming to have brushed shoulders with her. But for police, the medical findings raised a deeper question. If Latrice knew she carried a deadly strain, did that mean every man on her list, the names and faces scrawled in her notebook, was already dead? And if so, how many more were out there too afraid or too ashamed to come forward until it was too late? As Hughes flipped through the notebook under the sterile glow of the evidence room, she found one entry circled in red. Ethan, weak eyes, quiet laugh. Perfect. It was confirmation. Ethan hadn't been unlucky. He had been chosen. And Latrice, whatever her real name was still free. By the second week of September, Atlanta wasn't just talking about Ethan Miller's condition. They were obsessed with the woman who had vanished into the night. She had a dozen names. To the police, she was Latrice Johnson. To the medical records, she was Vanessa Moore. To the press, she was already branded with a nickname that stuck: the Black Widow of Atlanta. Detective Carla Hughes felt the weight of every headline. Each time she walked into the precinct, she passed news vans camped outside, cameras pointed at the glass doors. Journalists shouted the same question again and again. Have you caught her yet? Is she still infecting men? The truth was Latrice was proving impossible to pin down. Every lead unraveled into smoke. The car she abandoned in Clayton County had been wiped clean, no fingerprints, no DNA. The lease for her apartment was signed with a fake ID, backed by prepaid cards purchased at gas stations. Even her phone number from the dating app had been deactivated, leaving behind nothing but dead data. But Hughes wasn't about to give up. She and her partner Cole began retracing Latrice's digital footprint. From the shoebox of photographs and names found in her apartment, they contacted nearly 30 men. Half hung up immediately, terrified their wives or girlfriends would find out. A few admitted to meeting Latrice once or twice, but claimed they felt fine. 2 others were already dead, both in cases initially ruled as natural causes, though coroners had noted unexplained rapid tissue decay. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Still, forensics alone wouldn't catch her. Hughes needed someone who had seen Latrice after Ethan's night of horror. The first break came from a clerk at a motel outside Macon. He remembered a heavy-set black woman checking in under the name Sandra Lewis. She paid cash, stayed for 3 nights, and left behind a strange smell in the room that forced staff to rip out the mattress. When shown a photo of Latrice, the clerk didn't hesitate. That's her. That's the lady. Police canvassed the area, but found nothing. Security footage showed her walking out in the early morning hours, wrapped in a large coat, carrying a single duffel bag. The timestamp read 4:12 a.m. She never came back. Another lead placed her in Birmingham, Alabama, just 2 days later. A rideshare driver told detectives he'd picked up a woman matching Latrice's description near a Greyhound station. She was sweating heavily, coughing in her sleeve, but insisted on being dropped at a rundown boarding house. By the time police arrived, the room she rented was empty. Nothing left but a broken lamp and a half-empty bottle of vodka. Everywhere she went, Latrice seemed to shed her identity like a snake shedding skin. New names, new wigs, new addresses. But the trail she left behind was always the same. Men who went missing or men who wound up in emergency rooms with unexplained infections. To the public, the case took on a life of its own. Talk radio shows called her a modern-day Typhoid Mary. Podcasts speculated she might be targeting men deliberately, luring them with promises of affection before delivering what one host described as a kiss of rot. On social media, theories spiraled out of control. Some claimed Latrice had connections to underground bioresearch labs. Others said she was part of a cult. Memes spread showing her face photoshopped with spider fangs, captioned, "Swipe right and die." Through it all, Hughes kept working. One evening, exhausted and buried in files, she found herself staring at a single line from Latrice's notebook. "They will find me when I'm ready." Not before. It wasn't bravado. It was the truth. Every time police closed in, Latrice seemed to slip away with uncanny precision, as though she could predict their moves. Motel cameras caught glimpses of her just before raids. Neighbors reported seeing her car drive off minutes before squad cars arrived. Then came the near capture. 2 weeks in the manhunt, Hughes received a tip from a trucker who claimed he'd seen Latrice at a diner off I-75. She was sitting alone in a corner booth, wearing sunglasses despite the dim light, stirring a cup of coffee she never drank. When Hughes and Cole rushed to the location, adrenaline pounding, the waitress confirmed it. She left just 5 minutes ago. Outside, in a rain-slicked parking lot, they spotted her. A large woman in a hooded coat, limping slightly, heading toward a battered sedan. Hughes shouted, "Latrice! Police! Don't move!" For a moment, Latrice froze. Then, with startling speed, she dove into the car. The engine roared, tires screeched, and within seconds she was gone, swallowed by the highway. Hughes slammed her fist against the cruiser's dash. They had been seconds, mere seconds, away from ending it. The pursuit stretched into neighboring states. The FBI was brought in, classifying Latrice as a public health threat. Posters bearing her image went up in bus stations, rest stops, and clinics across the South. Anonymous hotlines flooded with calls. Most false, a few chillingly credible. But no matter how many nets they cast, the Black Widow slipped through. And back at Grady Memorial, as Ethan Miller's family kept vigil beside his hospital bed, they knew one terrifying truth. While their son lay rotting away, the woman who had done this to him was still out there. Still hunting. Still choosing her next victim. For 3 weeks, Ethan Miller's life was reduced to a hospital room sealed off like a crime scene. Nurses taped warning signs across the door. Isolation, extreme precautions. Anyone entering suited up in full protective gear, faces hidden behind masks and shields. The room hummed with machines, but no amount of technology could disguise the unmistakable odor that clung to the air. The stench of a body decomposing while still alive. His family visited daily, though most could not bear to stay long. His sister, Rachel, broke down the first time she walked in. "That's not my brother," she sobbed, clutching her father's arm. That's something else." Doctors tried to prepare them for what they'd see. Ethan's body shriveled and bloated in uneven patches, flesh discolored black and gray. His left arm was gone. His right leg ended just above the knee. Bandages soaked through within hours, no matter how often they were changed. His skin tore like wet paper at the lightest touch. Yet somehow, he was still conscious, still able to whisper through cracked lips. Reporters swarmed outside the hospital. The story had grown too large to contain. Headlines screamed, "Atlanta man rotting alive. Black Widow still at large. Is this a bioterror threat?" Satellite trucks parked in every available space. Cameras capturing the grief of Ethan's family each time they walked in or out. His mother once tried to speak, but broke down after 2 words, collapsing into the arms of a nurse. The footage aired nationwide, replayed endlessly. Inside the room, Ethan drifted in and out of lucidity. Sometimes he begged doctors to cut more off, to stop it from spreading. Other times he whispered for his father, asking him to tell the story of fishing trips they'd taken when he was a boy. In rare lucid moments, he tried to explain to detectives what he remembered of Latrice. Her perfume, her laugh, the way she looked at him in the mirror that morning as his skin began to rot. But most haunting was what he said to his sister late one night, when only the 2 of them were in the room. Rachel leaned close, tears streaming, as Ethan rasped, "I don't feel alive anymore. It's like I died the moment I touched her." The medical team fought valiantly. They cycled through experimental antibiotics, high-dose antivirals, even considered placing him in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber for days on end. Nothing slowed the devastation. Each morning, new patches of necrosis appeared, sometimes spreading inches overnight. His organs began to fail one by one. Dialysis machines hummed constantly by his bed. His heart struggled under the stress, skipping beats, racing, then stalling. On September 28th, after yet another emergency surgery to remove dead tissue, doctors delivered the news his family had dreaded. There was nothing more they could do. Ethan's body was beyond saving. It was no longer about treatment, only comfort. That evening, as the sun sank over Atlanta, casting orange light across the hospital skyline, Ethan Miller took his final breaths. His father held his hand, his mother pressed her forehead against his, and Rachel whispered in his ear that she loved him, over and over, until his chest stilled. Outside the hospital, Hughes stood by the entrance when she got the call from the attending physician. Time of death, 7:42 p.m. She closed her eyes, clenched her jaw, and muttered the word she'd been dreading. "We lost him." The city's grief was immediate. Candlelight vigils appeared on sidewalks outside Grady Memorial. Strangers left flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes addressed to the rotting man, begging for justice. Hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag justice for Ethan. Hashtag stop the widow. Hashtag rotting man case. Talk shows debated the morality of her actions. Was Latrice simply a sick woman lashing out, or a calculated predator who used her body as a weapon? Ethan's funeral, held at a small Baptist church in suburban Atlanta, was covered live on local TV. His casket was closed. There was no way anyone could see what was left of him. The pastor's voice shook as he said, Ethan was a son, a brother, a man with his whole life ahead of him. Taken not by accident, not by illness, but by cruelty. Detective Hughes sat in the back pew, listening, guilt heavy on her shoulders. She had chased Latrice across counties, come within seconds of catching her at that diner. Now Ethan was dead, and the Black Widow was still out there. She couldn't shake the thought, if she had moved faster, been sharper, maybe he would still be alive. The FBI doubled its task force the very next day. Ethan's death changed everything. What had been treated as a disturbing but isolated case was now a homicide investigation. The Black Widow wasn't just a fugitive, she was a killer. And somewhere out there, maybe in another state, maybe even another city, she was alive, breathing, and choosing her next victim. Ethan Miller's death did not close the case. If anything, it widened it into something bigger than Atlanta, bigger than Georgia. His story became a cautionary tale that spread across America, about lust, about secrets, about the terrifying truth that sometimes the greatest dangers don't come from a gun or a knife, but from a single human touch. In the weeks after his funeral, the search for the woman known as Latrice Johnson intensified. The FBI plastered her face, drawn from dating app photos and security footage, across bus stations, airports, and billboards. News anchors repeated her aliases: Vanessa Moore, Sandra Lewis, Tanya Brooks. They warned viewers that she might look different, thinner or heavier, with wigs or without. She could be anyone. She could be anywhere, one anchor warned. But despite the manhunt, she was never found. Every trail ended in silence. Every tip led to empty rooms, abandoned cars, motel beds that reeked of decay. It was as if she dissolved into the shadows the moment Ethan died. And so, the Black Widow of Atlanta became part of America's modern folklore. Podcast hosts dissected her case in binge-worthy seasons. True crime YouTubers replayed her story with ominous music and blurred photos of Ethan's last days. Talk shows debated what drove her. Was it vengeance? Was it madness? Or was it something even darker, a deliberate campaign of terror using her own body as a weapon? For Ethan's family, the speculation was salt in an open wound. His sister Rachel stood outside the courthouse one afternoon, clutching a framed photo of Ethan in better days, and said through tears, "People can turn this into stories, into legends. But for us, this was a man, a brother, a son. We don't need a legend. We need justice." But justice never came. Without an arrest, the legal system had nothing to offer. Ethan's death certificate read, "Complications of necrotizing infection." But his family knew it was something more, a murder executed in silence, invisible to the naked eye. And the public? They moved on, as they always do. New scandals filled headlines. New tragedies grabbed attention. Yet every so often, Ethan's story would flare back into the spotlight. A new podcast, a Reddit thread, a TikTok video retelling the nightmare in under 3 minutes. Each time, the same reaction: disbelief, horror, fascination. Even now, in Atlanta, people whisper. Some claim they saw her in a grocery store parking lot, heavy set and sweating, eyes darting behind oversized sunglasses. Others swear she moved to another state, living under a new name, waiting. The police neither confirm nor deny. Detective Carla Hughes, now retired, once gave a rare interview. When asked what haunts her most, she didn't hesitate. That smile. Every witness who described her said the same thing, that she smiled when men looked nervous. Like she knew something they didn't. Like she knew what was coming. For many, that smile is the scariest detail of all. Because Ethan Miller's story isn't just about one man's tragic death. It's about the danger of the unknown, about how easily a life can unravel from a single decision. A swipe on an app, a knock on a stranger's door, a night that seemed exciting, even harmless, until it wasn't. And so the legend endures. The Rotting Man case. The Black Widow of Atlanta. A story that blurs the line between true crime and urban legend, fact and nightmare. Perhaps the most unsettling part is this. Somewhere out there, she may still be alive. Another name, another apartment, another man too curious, too lonely, or too reckless to walk away. And if that's true, then the story isn't over. It's just waiting for the next chapter.